So let's see. But the trick is, well, the one thing similar with all simulations is, including particles, which aren't really a simulation, they can be baked. So you have to like simulate it, and if you want it to like be solidified and like not change, you have to bake it, and you'll see lines down here. So let's just add a few cubes and just move them here. And if you hit R, it rotates, but if you double tap R, you get this kind of weird trackball style rotation. Okay, so we have a few cubes. Let's maybe stack those up on top of each other. And I would say this is called rigid body simulations. I would say this is one of the easier ones to do, but there's a few quirks in it that we'll go over now. So at first, you just click whatever cube you want to be a rigid body and have physics affect it. So here's the physics tab. It looks like a ball bouncing. You click it and look for rigid body. And now I have choices for like what type of rigid body. Active means it's an object in motion. Passive means it'll be something like the ground. It's going to have an impact on other objects, but it's not moving or doing anything. It's just there, but things can run into it. So I just made that inactive, and now if I click play, it's going to fall basically for eternity. It went through this one because this one isn't being seen by the simulation. So we could make that also an active, but let's make it a passive, which means now it's having like influence, but it's not actually doing anything. But you could also make a ground plane and make this rigid body and passive. So here's one of the quirks I find with rigid body, and I don't think I'll be able to get it to glitch, but maybe if I make this like here's the mass. So if I make this like 500,000, maybe it'll just, yeah. Sometimes it'll like break through a plane because rigid bodies like to have like some thickness to them. So instead of making just a plane be your ground, it's better to make a cube. You go into edit mode and you scale the cube down on the Z-axis, and then if I scale and hit Shift Z, I'm going to scale it on everything except the Z. So just keep that in mind, and someday when your objects are falling through each other, you might remember like, oh, let me give that ground some thick. Well, now okay. Got to make it a rigid body and passive. So let's make all these active. And I think one of them was set to like, this one is like super heavy, so if we put that one on top, it might have an interesting effect. Notice how these ones just get pushed away really easily because this one weighs 50,000 times more than those ones. A couple other things. Well, how about we just pause this and you guys can play around with that for a little bit. Okay, so Caleb has something set up like this, which is cool. He has this torus, a cube, and a cone, and he wants them to fall. Let's see what happens. So look, this torus is hitting an invisible wall, right? It's like it's seeing, it's seeing something, but not what we want it to see. And that's because when you make a rigid body, by default, it's going to give you the settings that are like optimized. So it's saying your rigid body collision, it's looking at a convex hull. So even if you have a really smooth sphere, that's kind of like an icosphere. It's very angular and triangular. But if you switch this to mesh, or you could optimize, like have a cube be a cube, a cone be a cone. But if you have shapes that are starting to be slightly more complicated with interior edges, you have to choose the mesh. And let's see if it now you get a ring over the cone. So if you want to know the size of your objects in a scene, like right now we just have these kind of generic numbers. This domino is 0.7 units wide and it's 2 units tall. But if you go into your scene settings, you can switch your unit presets to be like feet or inches. So, or millimeters, centimeters. Let's do feet. So this this domino, which we see it as a domino, we assume it's small. It's actually waist high, which would be a really big domino. And then so this ball is like waist high. That's why it's important to like keep track of the scale of your objects. But instead of scaling everything down, you could cheat. So it's good to like keep track and make a domino like 2 inches long when you're beginning. But if you get to the point where you love your simulation and you don't want to like have to start from scratch really, you could speed this up. So maybe this is like 10 times bigger than I want. Let's in your scene settings where we set the degree or the feet unit, let's set the speed of our simulation by, I'm gonna like times it by 10. Whoa. Okay, so that's like kind of too. So that might look like real dominoes. It might be slowed down a little bit, but that's where it's good to pull out some real dominoes and actually watch with your eyes and be like, how fast do these really fall? Maybe even record it. Nothing beats actual like observation when it comes to making your animations look. But right now that looks pretty real to me. Going on one layer or whatever. This is kind of a cool little trick though. In your scene settings, let's see. So if I wanted to make like multiple simulations going on in one scene, what you can do is like click your passive, well, you have to do this with every object. But you see collision groups, so right now all of these dominoes are on a single collision group. So if I went to a different layer and made, a new object and made it a rigid body and put it to a new collision group, I could in theory have this simulation going. Let's see if I share the same layer. So I'm going to make this one, pretty heavy. I don't know what CWT stands for in mass if we're using imperial units. Maybe it's something like tons. I don't know. But anyways, notice how this is a rigid body, but it's like totally ignoring the other things. So you might need that. You might need a situation where you want some things interacting on one group and others interacting on another, and that's how you would do that. I'm going to make a new project. Let's say I have a ground here. It's passive, active. So you might realize sometimes your objects are behaving strangely. Let me So like that didn't look really realistic. If you watch closely, they kind of, like this one right here, and the reason it's not behaving normally, it should be like just bouncing off that and rolling, but it all depends on their origin point. So you want your origin points to be centered, and the origin point of this one is like way outside the cube. Same with this one, same with this one. So if I select all those, you can search for origin, because we want to set the origin. You can go up to Tools, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry, and now they'll behave like normally. So you usually encounter problems like that in the tutorial by that Blender guru. He like makes a cube, and he uses an array modifier to make like a bunch of cubes, and then he adds another array modifier to make like a bunch more cubes, and then he adds another array modifier So to make those actual rigid body objects, you need to apply the array modifier. And once you apply it, like this cube, well, you go into edit mode and you can separate them all with P by loose parts. And now they're all individual cubes, but their origin was back where it was originally created. So if you just select everything, I'm going to use the shortcut. Control Shift Alt C, origin to geometry. And there is a physics tab. I think they're going to be getting rid of this in the future version of Blender, which I'm not sure I agree with. It is a pretty convenient tab, but everything with everything selected that you want, you can just hit Add Active, and now those are all they're all active objects, and they all have the rigid body modifier on it. So there is a physics tab, at least in the current version of Blender, that you can also select everything and remove the physics. So it is pretty a handy little tab that you might end up using. But what I wanted to show you, like our first assignment was creating a bouncing ball. And I'm just going to use a plane because I think it'll be fine. Rigid body, add a passive, and if you add a sphere and make it active, go to frame 1. It doesn't bounce, but you do have the option in the both the active object and the passive. You can add some bounciness or friction. So if we add the bounciness up to 1 on the passive object, the ground, and add a bounciness, I don't think the result will be that realistic because it seems to like not lose any energy in its bounce. It's just like things don't really behave that way, but you might be in a situation where you want that. So, but as you can see, as you start decreasing the bounce on both 0.5, 0.5, you lose a lot of, there was a slight bounce there. So maybe have this be, the ball be 1 bouncy and the ground be like 0.75. And we have huge objects, so let's speed up our simulation by 3. So like with just a few clicks, we could have made our animation the first day of class. We could have let Blender figure out the animation. So why wouldn't you do that? One thing is there's no like squash and stretch. So if you want to add those like kind of subtle touches, it's good to just like hand animate this. Also, as you can see, it kind of rolls in a weird pattern. I think because it's like rolling on some invisible faces we don't see. But if you have tons of balls that are bouncy and you don't, I mean, this would be like a great reason to not hand animate all those, because this would just take too long to get like a realistic result. But it would be cool to add like a basketball texture to those, and who knows, you could even add like some text. You know, and all of a sudden you have like UAF basketball promo, you know. Yeah, so, and people will think like, that's amazing, or they won't even, they'll just think it was a plugin or like an Instagram thing, and they don't think you did any work, which happens too. So one more thing. Another cool little thing about these active objects is like let's say you don't want, let me line them up a little bit. Let's say you don't want any of them to move until like one is hit by the other. Okay, because like right now I hit simulate and they all fall. But let's say I want them to kind of, one hits the other and hits the other. So let's go to this bottom one. We have our active set. And what you can do is, there's this deactivation. And we're going to enable deactivation and enable start deactivation. So I don't know why, it seems like you'd only need one. But yeah, you have to turn them both on. And let's do this for the same one here too. So now this is the only one that's like active. And as you can see, one clips the other, and let's move this one down a bit. So once the first one gets within that field, the convex hull that we can't quite see of the other, it's going to activate it, and then that one will activate the other one, and you can then have your simulations start that way. So that's nice. Let's turn on start deactivation with this one too. So now nothing's happening. And let's maybe move this one over here and maybe put a bunch. So these all have that start deactivation on. I'm going to put my cursor to selected and make a force field. And let's just give this a strength of like 200, something high. So right now the force field is pushing all of these balls. You know, it's kind of like blowing them in the wind. So force fields can have an impact, but you can set the maximum influence of the force field and drag this up. So now the force field ends once it gets outside that sphere. So I hit play, nothing's happening, but if I increase the maximum, once it touches that one now moves. So force fields can also start your deactivation or start the activation. Let's change this to be a strength of like 1,000. And I'm going to add a keyframe on my force field. So here's a way to like kind of throw an object or push an object strongly into another. I'm going to go a few down and add my next keyframe. And maybe I'll lower this because I want the object to be pushed in kind of an upward arc. So let's see. So here's a way, if you had your tower of bricks or whatever, you could have them all set to start deactivation, and that looks cool to me. Yeah, and they bounce nicely. Notice how one of them bounces into the force field and kind of gets thrown back. So you may want to like keyframe the location of your force field to get out of the way. Or you could just keyframe the size back to 0. But let's see, anything else? Okay, the last thing. Let's say you want to keyframe this ball. So I want it to just kind of like run into this one maybe. And then, so I'm going to go ahead a few keyframes, run into that one, and then go ahead a few frames, and then like run into those. Now, when I set the keyframes, and it should be moving. If I turn off the rigid body of it, you see how it moves. When I turn on the rigid body, because I want it to have an impact, well, we don't even have to, it just ignores those keyframes. So what you have to do in active, you check the animated box, and now it's now an animated object. And the cool thing about animating it is I can keyframe when I want that to stop being an animated object. So let's say right about here it's going up, and like right at this point, let's say I don't want it to be animated. So I'm going to hover over here, put a keyframe on that, go to the next frame, turn off the animated part, add a new keyframe. So from here to here, the object will stop being animated. It'll just return to being a physical object. So if you want to have like a plane or some like car being thrown into a building, you may want to keyframe a few frames of the car, like getting at that forward velocity, and then turn off the animated part of it using keyframes once it starts wreaking havoc on like your cubes, and then it'll just like roll around. So that's how you can have much more control over your physics.